So I'm going to go through a few different data points that are related to business ownership and business creation in Louisville. We don't have a ton of data on the topic, but I think putting them together will paint a picture. This map shows business filings across Jefferson County zip codes in 2020. And although not every zip code's equal, most of them are pretty close together. And it shows that people in every neighborhood of Louisville are starting businesses. Unfortunately, we don't know the race of the people who are starting these businesses, but the relative consistency suggests that it's common for everyone. Entrepreneurship is everywhere. If you can go to the next slide, then this shows data at the MSA, meaning Louisville and 10 surrounding counties. And it shows data on business ownership for Black residents. You see that if you take Louisville, if you can go back one, please. The left bar shows the Louisville and 10 surrounding counties, where Black residents make up about 15% of the population. So this is a little bit bigger than Louisville, which is the data that I think we're used to hearing. And if you look at business ownership of all kinds of businesses, you see that Black residents own about 10% of businesses, meaning that they're underrepresented but not by a ton. If we look at some slightly different data, which is the next slide, this is just focusing on Jefferson County, and it's just focusing on businesses that have employees, so businesses that have expanded. And what we see is that although Black residents make up about 23% of the population, they only make up about 2.3% of employer business owners. So if you can go to the next slide, none of these data are directly comparable. It's not exactly apples to apples, but it's not apples to oranges either. What we see is that entrepreneurship is common throughout Louisville. What we see is that business ownership is common within the Black community. And although Black residents are underrepresented as business owners, it's not by much. When you look at businesses that have scaled, then Black residents are much more underrepresented, suggesting that the barrier isn't entrepreneurship or anything, it's access to capital, it's access to being able to expand a business. And probably one of the most important issues there is access to capital. So let's see, I think I will pick which points to include so that I can keep us on track. But the points I will make are that the most common sources of capital for business owners are personal savings, friends and family, so pre-existing wealth. The second most common source of funding is a bank loan that you receive with personal collateral. The third most common source of funding is bank loans secured with business assets. So there's an important cycle where access to capital prevents many Black residents from expanding businesses. On the topic of homeownership, I'll point out a couple of data points that we've put together. The left is based on some research from Dr. Andre Perry at the Brookings Institute, and his research found that Black homes in Louisville, homes in majority Black neighborhoods, are undervalued by about 27%. So that if you took the same home and put it in a similar neighborhood with the same size lot, with similar schools, with the same walkability, parks and safety, and all the things that people care about when buying a house, it would be worth quite a bit more. On the flip side of this, which the bottom part of the graph shows, Black homeowners are taxed at a higher rate than white homeowners. Not just because many Black homeowners live in the urban services district, but also because of the way we assess properties. We assess homes every 3 years. So if your house is skyrocketing in value, you're going to pay taxes on the amount that it was assessed in year one. And when your house goes up in value the next year, you're going to pay the same amount of taxes. When it goes up the next year, you're going to pay the same amount of taxes. So if you can skip forward 2 slides, that would be good. So this graph shows the change in home prices for 2 Louisville zip codes from 1998 to 2020, 1998 to 2020, excuse me. The orange line is for zip code 40212, and the blue line is for zip code 40204. So if you take inflation into account, Over those 22 years, homes in 40204 went way up in value. And that is the kind of equity that is created that gives people the capital to start businesses. If you look at the average home in 40212, what you see is that adjusting for inflation, it decreased in value. So homes and businesses are the two most common and most important sources of wealth in the United States. And it's important to be upfront with the ways in which Black people, particularly homeowners and business owners, have seen their assets devalue. There isn't enough opportunity for us to drift towards equality without intentional efforts like the kind that Cynthia talked about. And ignoring the connection between race and wealth means that those disparities will just persist. So with that, I will pass it back to Monica.
Excuse me, thank you. Lyndon, if you could go to the next slide, please. All right, so as you can see, I don't have any data to show you. That's because we don't really collect it or we ignore it. And what's troubling is that even though we don't have the data, we have a narrative. The narrative, to put it bluntly, is that the West End or the Black community needs to be supervised and policed, and that there's some sort of defection or we're defective, and that we are just committing crimes, and that criminalization and policing is the most effective means to stop that. However, the data actually show that community investment is more effective. We don't hear the city talking about community investment data. They just show crime data to uphold that narrative. And when you uphold that narrative, you start starving community organizations that are actually doing the work to prevent crime and violence. So we don't have data on the root causes because we either don't collect it, because there's a reasons people don't want to ask, or we're ignoring it. And the path forward is very serious about this, so much so that they've contracted me. They're putting their money where their mouth is to help them find and uplift this missing and ignored data. And with that, I will pass it to Reverend Tim.
Thank you, Monica. I think when you think about this idea of justice, and more specifically social justice, there are three commonalities: equal rights, equal opportunity, and equal treatment. If I were to define justice, I would say social justice means equal rights and equitable opportunities for all. I think one of the overarching goals of the path is to transform our criminal legal system away from policing and punishment toward healing and community investment. And the hope is to receive adequate funding that is essential to keeping us safe, such as health, housing, infrastructure, and education. Because one of the best ways to prevent crime is to provide more resources and support to many of these low-income communities. And I'll add in, nobody knows how to speak to the ills in Black communities like Black people. And I think that so many times funds are given, but they're given with strings attached. And I think that that's a form of injustice as well. So again, one of the necessary conversations that we have to have is that the great obstacle to our path forward to a more equitable Louisville, a more just or justice-focused Louisville, is a continued lack of openness, as Monica has highlighted, a lack of data, a lack of accountability, a lack of transparency. And this is a critical piece of the path to healing, moving forward, to us becoming that justice-oriented city. The more our city leaders provide in the way of data and transparency, the more it increases trust, honesty, and integrity. And with that, I will yield my time.
Thank you for that. And I do want to add one other thing to this conversation around justice, which is that we all are understanding that there is some negotiation about having some additional responders with not police when we're talking about mental health and other things. And we want to make sure that our city follows through there as well. And so I think at this point, we will look at the education data from the Greater Louisville Project.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kindergarten readiness. We created this early childhood report in conjunction with Metro United Way's Ready for K Alliance And I really want to thank Ashley Brandt and Dr. Kishikumi Price for their direction and feedback on it. Our early childhood is a huge category, so we looked specifically at kindergarten readiness, childcare, adverse childhood experiences, and child food security. I'm not going to talk about all of those today, but if you want to dig deeper or look at more data, you can visit our website. The reason we chose to focus on kindergarten readiness was partly based on community feedback, but also because of how important it is. Just like all tests and evaluations, it's not the end-all be-all of how prepared every kid is for kindergarten, but it's a very strong predictor of future success in school. Black children who enter JCPS who are kindergarten ready are more than 3 times as likely to be at their grade level in math and reading when they get to 3rd grade. So whatever we can do to prepare more kids to enter school, the more likely they are to thrive. In the 2019-2020 school year, which is the one on the far right of the graph, 52% of JCPS students entered kindergarten ready. And the average for Black students was about equal to that at 50% kindergarten ready. There's a lot of things that go into kindergarten readiness. The state's data cabinet has done a lot of research on what predicts it. And most of those things have to do with your family composition. So they can predict most kids' kindergarten readiness based on their mother's education, how many siblings they have, and those kinds of things. But the thing that's the most easy to influence, and that's the most important, is the setting of children before they go into kindergarten. So what was their experience like the year before? Were they in preschool? Were they at home, et cetera? So this graph shows kindergarten readiness for Black students in JCPS, broken down by the setting that they were in the year before they entered kindergarten. The top lines are public preschool, so Head Start and state-funded preschool. What I think is cool about those categories is that if you compare Black children to children of other races, Black children perform the best. Once you remove income from the equation, the Black kids who go into JCPS after being in public preschool rocket. So I think that shows the importance of a good learning environment, setting up children to thrive. The next line, which is the red line, is childcare. And what I think is interesting about looking at this data specifically for Black JCPS students is that if you look at the data for all students, the childcare line is way above all of the other ones. Childcare seems to be the best setting for all children. It's likely tied a lot to income, but it raises the question, what is the difference in the quality and access of childcare for Black children compared to all other children in Louisville? The light blue line is other, which means children are not in a professional care setting, also not at home with their parents. So that could mean that they're with a tutor. It could mean that they're with a different relative. And I don't have a ton of explanation for you, unfortunately, as to what's changing with that line to make it go down. And the very bottom line is home, which means children who are at home with their parents the year before they enter school. The fact that it's so low, the fact that in the most recent school year, only 29% of those children enter school kindergarten ready means that we need to do work to support these families. So we either need to A, give them all the resources that they need to make sure that their children are prepared for any assessments, or give them all of the resources that they need to have a really good, strong foundation for their children while they're teaching them. Or we need to remove barriers so that they can put their children in childcare. Some of these parents are keeping their kids at home out of opportunity because they know that they're going to be able to provide the best education for their kids. Some of them are keeping them at home out of necessity because there isn't quality childcare, affordable childcare that's sensitive to their children's emotional and mental health. With that, I'm going to talk a little bit about barriers to access for childcare for children in Louisville. This graph shows for preschoolers the number of slots available at different price levels. So each red dot there is a childcare provider in Louisville. And at the preschool level, there are several thousand slots available. Most of them cost over $30 a day. If you go to the next slide, This red horizontal line shows the amount of money that the state of Kentucky will pay for childcare if you can't afford it. So almost no childcare centers in Louisville are affordable to families with low incomes, even though we have a program designed to subsidize it. Additionally, most families still have to pay co-pays when they send their children to childcare, even if they qualify for reimbursement from the state of Kentucky. There's also issues with childcare providers receiving payment. This is a tough graph because childcare providers can't just lower their prices. Childcare workers in Louisville already earn a median of under $10 an hour. It is a tough business to be in, and there isn't enough support going into it to enable childcare providers to make it affordable to families, or for families to be able to widely afford different childcare providers. If you go to the next slide, location is also an issue. So this is a summary of different neighborhoods in Louisville. Each dot represents a different neighborhood. The y-axis shows the number of slots available in that neighborhood, and the x-axis shows the race of the children who are in that neighborhood. So the more left you are on the axis, the more white children there are in that neighborhood, and the more to the right you go, the more Black children, Hispanic children, Indigenous, or other people of color. What we see is that the neighborhoods with the highest availability of childcare tend to have more white children. This is especially an important barrier for families who don't have access to transportation or who are trying to juggle multiple kids at multiple different centers with different schools. It just gets complicated quick. And then I think the next graph shows childcare provider availability by hours. So the red line shows the availability Monday through Friday, and the yellow and black line show availability on the weekends. The higher the line is, the more slots available, and the bottom axis shows the time of day. So basically what you see is that almost all childcare in Louisville is available Monday through Friday, about 6 to 6. But if you work second shift or third shift, if you work on the weekend, if you don't have consistent hours, you're going to struggle to find a licensed childcare provider in Louisville for your kids. Black and brown workers in Louisville are more likely to work outside of the normal 9 to 5 business hours. So this is a barrier for children, and it's also a barrier for employment for parents. So with that, my main takeaway from this is that childcare is very important, but it's a difficult business and it's difficult for families to navigate, though it's incredibly important for child success. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Megan really quick to talk about digital access in Louisville, also very important for children to succeed in school.
Thanks, Harrison. Yeah, so I'm going to talk through some of our data from digital divide work. When we talk about digital divide, we're giving a name to the disparity between those that have full digital access and those that do not. And we're defining digital access specifically as possessing both a usable internet connection, which often means a high-speed internet connection, and a computer or tablet to use it where you live. Notwithstanding the exponential increase in need as we first went into lockdown, full digital access is an integral facet of daily life that intersects everything from access to healthcare, education, as Harrison noted, criminal justice, and housing security. It's vital for remote work, job upskilling, academic enrichment, digital health literacy, and social connection. COVID brought renewed attention to the need for full digital access, specifically in the world of remote education. A recent study identified that a full 30% of students across the United States didn't have adequate access when schools first shuttered in 2020. And across Louisville, 34%, or more than 1 in 3 households, do not have full digital access. And it's important to note when we talk about this data that it's reported at the household level. And because of that, a family with internet access and 1 laptop or tablet for a working parent and 2 children is recorded as having the same access as a household where everyone has a laptop. And this can make it really difficult to understand individual experiences within households, as some households are going to have full access for every single person and some are not. But then looking at data for Black households in Louisville, more people rely on their smartphones for digital access or have little to no access at all than in the general Louisville population. This figure, which reflects 2019 data, shows us that 1 in 5 Black households rely on their smartphone for digital access. So that means they have a smartphone and internet connection only, or they only have a smartphone, or they're using their smartphone to access the internet on their device. And 1 in 7 have little to no digital access. If you want to go to the next slide. This next slide compares high-speed internet and device access by race with years of data collection on the x-axis and percent of white or Black households reporting access on the y. For the years data is available, the difference in access between white and Black households has remained relatively constant at about 20% more white households having access. And it's also important to note that access has remained relatively constant overall, right? So varying less than 10% for both groups between 2013 to 2019. I also want to make sure to note that we only include data on white and Black households here because the other available racial groups in the census have a very large margin of error. And understanding digital access differences in these and other racial groups is really critical to reducing the digital divide. We simply just don't have the data right now. If you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. We also see pretty obvious differences in income. Those households reporting an income of greater than $75,000 annually have almost universal access to the internet and a device to use it, more than 20% higher than those reporting an income of less than $10,000. I think the more interesting story perhaps in this figure though is also the huge increases that households making less than $10,000 have made in access since 2013. While households reporting an income of greater than $35,000 have changed in access by less than 10% since 2013, access for those making less than $10,000 has nearly doubled from about 41% in 2013 to 71% in 2019. The significance of digital access to one's ability to carry out basic life necessities is only going to increase as we become more embedded in the digital world. And so with that, I'll pass it back to Sadiqa.
Thank you so much. I just want to say this about early childhood. As a former inspector general for the state of Kentucky who regulated the childcare industry, I think it is important for us to have affordable childcare and to make sure, and I understand that there is a movement and we are a part of the movement to push for additional funding for childcare attendance. But I want to say we have to make sure that some of that funding goes for technical assistance. We do not have, just because you have a child care facility does not mean you have a quality child care facility. Quality matters very much. So we have to make sure to keep that in mind. Also, I want to talk a little bit about the out of school time framework as we see it. Through the path forward, what we have tried to do is gather some out of school time providers. It is very clear to us that there is not enough work happening in the middle school space and even in the high school space. We are going to be convening an educational retreat where we just really talk about what we are doing great, what we are not doing so great, who's doing what, and where we need to expand. We understand that every 11th grader is going to be taking the ACT. Every JCPS 11th grader will be taking the ACT this year. How do we do work that impacts and changes and helps with those scores? How do we do work in the elementary space? How do we do work in the middle school space that makes sense? What we are thinking with the path forward is that we need to focus on intentional tutoring for our children around math and reading. How do we really begin to close this achievement gap that is ever widening even now with the pandemic? How do we do that? We want to focus in on intentional tutoring with math and reading. The OST providers, here's what we're great at. In some cases, we're good tutors. Some of us are amazing, but how do we scale that? We've got to find programs that we can take and scale that focus on changing those math scores, focus on changing those reading scores. And then beyond that, we are here to provide the social emotional supports. We are the ones who take the kids on the college tours. We are the ones who make sure they have those experiences that lead to better backpack defenses. And they take all of those pictures to show that they've had these wonderful experiences. We are the ones that provide the hugs, that make sure that the barriers are removed. But we have not been focused in enough on closing the achievement gap. And that is what we're saying at the path forward. It is time for us to use these next 3 years, especially where we have this funding coming in from the federal government, going to JCPS, going to Louisville Metro, and quite frankly, being shared hopefully throughout the community with organizations that do the work and have been doing the work and have proven themselves to be committed, how do we focus in on closing that achievement gap? So what we see as a landscape is Evolve 502 is there to ensure that our students are going to college. They got it, right? We're calling our 9th, our 10th, our 11th, our 12th graders Evolve Scholars. And then we go from there, where those stools, those legs, you have the colleges, right? You've got U of L, Simmons, JCTC, the folks that are saying we are committed to ensuring that these students are going to college. And then you have the OST providers who have to help ensure that we're providing the wraparound services, the barrier removal, but also, again, those college tours and some of the other things that we know that only we do, and we do in a way that no other organizations are able to do. We're culturally competent, and I think this community is beginning to recognize how important that is. And so we want to make sure, though, that we are aligned with the school system, that we're aligned with Evolve 502, and that we're closing that achievement gap, and that we're sending our kids to college. In the next 3 years, we want to talk about really, first of all, right now, we want to talk about setting goals for the next 3 years to see a serious change in education level in Jefferson County. This is serious business. We've got serious money, and we do not have any excuses now, finally. And so there's more to come on that. And I will stop because we catch up on time. So I'll turn it over now to the next group.
Yes. So in regards to health, I just wanted to set it up by saying that when we talked about health as it relates to the path, we focus specifically on mental health. Given everything that as we started this call out, and you all could probably feel the emotion just in reliving those experiences, you know, for those of us who talked about it. But every day of the last 17, 18 months have been like that. And quite frankly, it was like that for a whole bunch of folks way before this pandemic started. And so we knew that if we were going to make it out of this on the other side and be better for it, we could not afford to not have our minds intact. And that is from the oldest of our community down to the youngest. And so we decided to put time and energy and effort into really prioritizing mental health and mental wellness for community members. And so I want to turn it over to Elishia Durrett Johnson, who has helped us do some of that work over the past year and a half.
Thank you so very much, Lyndon, for that amazing introduction and really good segue into everything. My name is Elishia Durrett Johnson, and I would begin to talk LLC. We have been working with the Path Forward and working and bringing other culturally competent mental health providers to bring services directly to our community. We know that in this past year, depression has had an uptick of 800%, just as well as anxiety has had an uptick of 600%. But all of those numbers disproportionately impact our Black community. And what Lyndon was alluding to was also with racial trauma. We understand that mental health, it's not something that we prescribe to, but a process that we subscribe to, right? It is a subscription, and the Path Forward understands that, and it's putting the work behind that. Last October 31st, we had a healing and mental health retreat where we were able to bring some services directly to our community. We had several minority therapists who are culturally competent and were able to bring these services directly, or healing services directly, to our community. Also on November 23rd of last year, we were able to bring our community crisis intervention, because we had some things happen in our community that we needed to make sure that we're immediately addressed, and we're able to do that. We also have some great events coming forward to highlight issues directly impacting our communities and to provide spaces for healing, understanding that we are putting monies behind this to make a model more sustainable for the healing of our community. And so with all of that, I'm going to yield whatever little time I have left back to you all. Thank you.
And before we transition to the next one, I do want to emphasize, though, that the path has also prioritized supporting Black healers in this space, because there are tons of them all over this city who have been doing work for years and who want to do work in this community. But also as entrepreneurs, as business owners, need to be funded and supported. And that has been a priority for us, has been lifting up those Black healers who are doing great work in our community, as well as connecting them to pathways to be able to broaden and expand their expertise into other areas as well.
Absolutely. And we are very thankful for the donors and supporters who have helped us be able to pay the folks who are doing the work. And with that, we'll turn it over to GLP for the data on housing.
Thank you. Let's see, Lyndon, if you could go to the first slide. So this data is from our housing justice report. And the interesting piece, I think, is less the data and more the framework. So that's what I'm going to focus on. The main data of this report is the Rental Assistance Prioritization Index, a measure created by the Urban Institute, probably by someone who never had to say it out loud. It suggests where to prioritize financial assistance during the COVID pandemic. It combines data on 3 topics. If you can go to the next slide. And those are housing instability. So where are cost burdened households? Which neighborhoods have the highest number of renters? It includes data about the impact of COVID. So which neighborhoods lost the most jobs due to COVID-19 or the least likely to have health insurance? And the third category is equity. Where do people of color and foreign-born residents live? There's 11 data points total, all mashed together to suggest where to prioritize funding. What I think is interesting is that a simpler approach might only take into account the first category or 2, housing instability and the impacts of COVID, and assume that those data capture the experience of Black people and other people of color, that it's baked into the data and it'll prioritize them by default. You might consider the data and then try to identify priority neighborhoods based on where Black people or people of color live, but it kind of divides the data into an objective piece based on housing information and then more of a squishy subjective piece that you're trying to bring along after the fact. Including where Black people live in the objective piece reflects A, that Black people have been intentionally harmed by policies, and directing the benefits of policies towards them is an important step towards equity. And 2, it just reflects that the experience of a Black person who loses their job due to COVID is different on average than the experience of a white person who loses their job. It acknowledges the discrimination in the housing market. It acknowledges that there are overlapping barriers for people of color that are not baked into the data already. So if we prioritize funding based on data without acknowledging that the same numbers can have different consequences for different people, we as data users have left out some important considerations. So while this map is based on a lot of objective data, the decision to include race in the analysis is a value judgment that I think is a good one. I think the traditional way to go about making decisions on where to prioritize funding would look at the data and then look at race separately and not try to combine them. But I think incorporating it into the data makes it stronger. And it's an important consideration for people who use data. So with that thought from us, I'm going to pass it on to Kevin Dunlap, I think.
Thank you. I am Kevin Dunlap, the Executive Director for REBOUND, Inc. And my work with the PATH has been very rewarding as well as challenging. We deal primarily in trying to increase the wealth of African Americans and primarily through homeownership. One of the things that we continue to find is that the African American community falls well behind in terms of homeownership, thus not having the opportunity to build equity for themselves and their family. Also in this work, And particularly during the pandemic, we realized that even though people were in situations of rental, we often found that they were in overcrowded situations, which we know through COVID that was not the ideal places for families to live in. So being an African-American led housing development corporation, probably the oldest one here in the city of Louisville, one of the things we realized is that we really needed to ramp up the work that we do, both in the area of creating home ownership opportunities, as well as looking at the creation of more affordable rental housing in this space. And we have done so. One of the things that in moving forward, we realized that we have to ramp up. We have to ramp up what we do at an expeditional speed in what we have done before in the past. And one of the things somebody asked, well, what's stopping you? The only thing that's stopping us at this point is access to capital, access to some of the capital, particularly that we call soft capital. That capital that can actually be used to offset some of the high costs of housing development right now. So I do think that we are staying right now in a space and time where significant differences can be made. And as Sadiqa has pointed out, we have the opportunity to really prove and move the needles in a lot of these areas over the next 3 years. So with that, I will yield to the next speaker.
Hello, my name is Nichole Leachman, and I oversee the Housing Counseling and Education Program at the Louisville Urban League. And what we do is we educate families on rental readiness. We offer them second chance leasing programs for those that may have had issues in the past with maybe an eviction. We help with educating those who want to become homeowners. So we will have them attend our 2.5-hour fit to rent or fit to buy class where they get information on budgeting, money management, home ownership, building wealth, and all those good things. And then they're invited to our housing counseling program where they'll meet with counselors one-on-one to help them work through any barriers that are preventing them from either renting or home ownership. So we have the homebuyer education class where we give them a wealth of information and walk them through the home buying process. In addition to those programs, once they purchase a home, they can come back for post-purchase counseling. We do loss mitigation or foreclosure prevention counseling for those who are in danger of losing their home or in foreclosure or in default. We just have a wealth of knowledge for individuals who are looking to improve their situation and just give them access to safe, decent, and affordable housing. And I will yield to the next.
I think what is important for you all to understand too is that there's been a transition. We're not only focused on affordable housing for purchase, so that is affordable housing with a pathway to Black ownership, but also affordable rentals, which are so important. We had 6,000 homeless children prior to the pandemic, so we have to make sure that we are providing affordable housing in this community. And we really are not going to be able to do that without proper investment. And thank goodness for some of our community partners who have been willing to invest in the Path Forward work. And I hope that people also understand that while we are the organizations that are here before you today, there are other organizations working with us. As an example, S4S is a partner in building affordable rentals throughout the city, are certainly concentrated right now in the West End. In fact, I think most people know that we just got a grant to help with affordable rentals in the Russell community. And the other thing that I think is important for folks to understand, we know that the legislation has passed in our community for TIF. We know that that can be a good thing. It is also a very scary thing. It could be a dangerous thing. We have not seen, and we challenge you to find a model in the United States of America where a community was revitalized without displacing Black people, poor people. We don't want to see that happen in Louisville. We want to see improvements made, and we want those improvements to be made with the community that is there living now, the very community that has had their backs broken by policies of this city in this country. And so with that, I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to spend some time with us at the Path Forward to learn more about it. Thank you for your support over this past year and in previous years, and thank you for the future support, not just of the Urban League, but all of the organizations that have signed the Path Forward and even some who haven't. We are all aligned if in fact the mission is to empower and improve outcomes for the Black community and really the entire community. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. I've been blessed and honored to be in this space. So I thank all of you who are here. We have a few minutes, maybe 10 or 15 minutes for a question and answer. Feel free to unmute or put your question in the chat. If we don't get to it, please feel free to email us to follow up. And then after the question and answer, Sadiqa or Ben, feel free to hop in when it's time to close. Does that sound good?
Sounds good. And I see a question from Michael Forbush. He asked about the overlap. He's asking about the West End Partnership being coordinated with the Path Forward. I think the West End Partnership Opportunity Partner, this is the TIF, right? Michael, is that what you're asking about, that work? I would say that we don't know how coordinated we're going to be able to be. We have not been able to participate yet in any of those meetings, but I understand that that's upcoming. So once we know, we're going to be, extremely transparent with the community, because we want to make sure that we are responsive to what community needs. So everywhere we can coordinate, we will be. And that's what you see with the Path Forward. That's why there are so many signers. It's because we wanted to be able to coordinate, because we understand that individually, no organization, no individual is able to move fast enough. Thank you for the question.
Feel free to unmute if you would like.
Thank you, Stephen.
Does anyone have questions on missing data points that they would like for the community to look into?
That's how you know you've given a really good presentation. I don't feel bad about not having questions, I have to tell you.
Drop mic and walk away.
I think we just acknowledge, until the questions come, that there really is a lot of work to do. We rushed through this presentation. Here we go. How do residents give input or interact with the Path Forward? So right now, the Path Forward really has been community members. This is always interesting for me, because I think about, like, at the league, where people say, well, how do people give input? Well, 23,000 visits in a year, there's a whole lot of input. We don't create something because people didn't ask for it. It grows out of the need. When we show up at the office and someone is sleeping in our parking lot because that's their house, and then we're helping to move that person from that car into a job, into an apartment. I mean, we are speaking from a community space, and it's always interesting to me when folks think about, well, you have all of these organizations, in this case, 50 or more organizations, but where are the people? And the people are in the organizations, the people are working with the organizations, and hopefully any leadership is being responsive to what the people are asking for. Because if there's something, I'll say for us, that we're doing that the community doesn't want, if we're not filling up the seats. So if we were doing housing counseling and we didn't have a waiting list, we wouldn't keep doing housing counseling. Where people say, why are we still building houses and we need more rentals? Well, we do need more rentals, but we've got more than 100 people on a waiting list for affordable housing. So that is the people speaking. So I feel like this is informed by community, by the people that are being served, the folks who are most impacted. And of course, we've had these conversations, and always on social media, people feel very comfortable adding lots of information. Missing justice data. Is there, Monica, there's a question here for you. I think missing justice data is so important. Thank you for pulling that out. Judith Jennings asked a question of you all at Greater Louisville Project. What missing data have you identified so far? That's for GLP.
So much. I think Dr. Unseld can speak to this. Part of this, particularly in this area, is the localization of wealth data. The speaker spoke so eloquently about the importance of being able to generate wealth as a protective factor against so many of the other interconnected things. So being able to really get a better handle on that locally. Certainly the data around justice and police. There's a lot of other data that our community partners want that we just can't localize. Megan did a good job of highlighting that there are so many marginalized groups that don't show up in any of our data because we don't have a sufficient sample size. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think one of the real things that we're trying to do is to continue to partner with organizations who can highlight for us what do they need to see. And we might not be able to do it, but we might be able to connect people to resources that can.
I also, even though I'm not with GLP, I can say that there's a dearth of literature when it comes to mental health in our communities in general, because of this, not just because of the stigma, but also the lack of distrust within certain research forums. And so to work with those leaders and to work with those researchers and those culturally competent researchers that's already in the community to gather that data is going to be priceless.
And I will add, since the Path Forward has contracted me, it's very important to recognize the importance and the talent of community-based researchers. We have some people who have a ton of data just because they live and breathe every day. Society just thinks you need to have degrees or initials behind your name for that data to be real. So some things we are going to do is to say, look at lived experiences, look at people who are doing experiments and collecting data, and uplift that data to fill some of the data gaps.
Absolutely. I also think it would be really interesting for us to, as we think about rebuilding, whatever's happening with our police and community, and think about the number of contacts that community members are having and how many of those are turning out, how they're turning out, what happens in Prospect versus what happens in the West End. That's some of the data we might be able to look at. When is force being used in our city? Where is it being used? And under what conditions? I think those are some of the things we can look at. There are a lot of different data points that I think are important. Some of them don't necessarily touch on what we've pointed out here, but even around the work that we do with expungements, just, a little bit off the topic, but I have to tell you, when we think about even education and how parents are able to go on field trips with their children or participate, how they're able to show up. Having a no insurance charge makes your record not eligible for expungement. No insurance sounds like it is a traffic offense, but in fact, it is a misdemeanor. And so in my view, that is really a crime of poverty. People who have the money buy insurance for their car. So what happens when you don't have insurance? You get cited. Once you've been cited for no insurance, you can't get insurance. The State Farm, most of the companies will not insure you. And so this vicious cycle that our people are in, we have to really talk about that. So we might want to look at the data on how some of these convictions really do impact and have unintended consequences, or maybe they are intended consequences, but consequences that we all aren't aware of. So there are lots of other things that we could think about studying and how they impact our community and who they're impacting. I think could be very interesting. And I'm just talking because I don't see another question. So somebody else wants to ask a question. It's there. Christina, we're going to let you have one of the last words, I think, in a few minutes. I also, want to say to everyone, I think we should have warned you about the video that we were going to play for June 1st from the David McAtee scene. But I think as traumatic as it might have been for many of you, hopefully for everybody here, you know, hopefully it was emotional. That is really, that's the struggle, to do this work, carrying all of that emotion every single day. And if you haven't had the opportunity to see it, I think Hannah Drake has written a phenomenal poem, which she's posted on Facebook, that everybody should look at today. I'm not being paid to advertise anything for Hannah Drake, but when I think about what has happened with Simone Biles, when I think about the runner who tested positive for marijuana and what she was dealing with in self-medication, when I think about Naomi Osaka deciding to remove herself from tennis competition, I am telling you all, the work that Elishia Durrett Johnson is doing with us on mental health is tremendously important. We are really being impacted in this community and in this country by racism. This conversation around critical race theory is painful, to see people who are not showing up with white hoods, but suits and ties, to hiss and boo at JCPS, the idea that our superintendent has been threatened. Please know that that is taking a toll. And so, Christina?
So I'm Christina Shade. I'm the Director of Investment at the Louisville Urban League. I've had probably a life-changingly fortunate experience of being a part of this work in this particular time and space. And I guess I would say, just specifically to white folks who are on the call, just to underscore what Sadiqa talked about in terms of the emotion of this work and the importance for us of staying grounded in what that is, because it so easily can become so abstract for us. And that's what privilege looks like, is being able to walk away from this and to choose not to look, or to choose not to see it, or to choose not to have family or friends or colleagues who are experiencing it. And so I think whether that means us watching videos or talking to folks or reading more or whatever it is, but the critical importance of staying connected to the emotion of what this is, because this is not a summer of 2020 problem. There was an inflection point. There was a realization for a lot of people who look like me that this was happening, but this is 400 years of history. And so in the same way, the response of what it looks like for the broader community, for the philanthropic community, for government officials, and for others, is to recognize that this is a community who is doing all of this work while dealing with everything else that's already on everybody's plates. And so the asking for resources to be invested in the work is so critical, and looking at the time frame for giving those resources of not just a 1 year time frame, right, but for the long haul, and recognizing that there are some spaces that have been so entirely uninvested in that the strategies of what it needs to come up with that, to use the resources effectively, requires time as well. In some cases, work is extremely ready to go and just needs money. In other cases, there has to be time to plan, and there has to be time to allow for people to do that. And I've had many conversations already from other folks in the community, other white folks, who feel like if there's not a response right now, if Black people can't deliver a response, people are done. They've moved on to the next thing, they're turning away. And if Louisville, I won't look at the negative side of it. I will say we have an opportunity to keep our focus on this work, to have a collective like a Path Forward who's continuing to lift it up, to have groups like GOP who are continuing to have accountability around it, and to use that as an opportunity to strategically and for the long term continue to invest in this work, and not to turn our eyes to it. And we've said to reporters who did a 1 year on the Path Forward, we said we hope every single year there's a touch point about what this looks like. So that's simply my call to others, is to stay focused in the space. I have zero doubt from any of the Black folks who are working in this work that they're backing away from it. I don't have that same level of assurance from other folks who look like me. So I think we have an opportunity to do it right. And I would ask for folks to be committed to that work. Thank you.
All right, I think as we approach our time, Christina, you did a wonderful job of encapsulating our aspirations here. One of the reasons that Greater Louisville Project took this on was to be able to create a clear benchmark of whether or not we have continued to do the work. How are we going to know? This is how we're going to know, because these numbers have to change. And if we invest in that, we will see change. And if we don't, we will see that as well. So I just want to give a real, express real gratitude to those who have done so much work over the course of this last year to help to make our community a more equitable, inclusive place that has opportunities that are not dependent on people's zip codes. So a particular shout out to the funders of the Greater Louisville Project, many of whom are on this call, many of whom are also funders of initiatives through A Path Forward. A shout out to the Greater Louisville Project team, particularly our fabulous community outreach czar, Dr. Monica Unseld, our amazing data team, Harrison and Megan, and to all the rest of the support team who has been great. Lopa, look forward to you as the next project director for the Greater Louisville Project. I hope that you are able to announce only good news during your tenure. And I just want to wrap saying, the fact that we are being intentional about this work with people who care so passionately, even when that is hard, it's such an ongoing inspiration. So thank you all so much for all that you do. Thank you for coming today. And look forward to being on this path together.
We love you, Ben. Thank you so much.
Appreciate you all. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Great job.